Hello, everyone, and welcome to the TDWI webinar program. I'm Andrew Miller, and I'll be your moderator. For today's program, we're going to discuss redefining clinical operations with Agentic AI, accelerating innovation across data management and site monitoring. And our sponsors today are Databricks and Hexaware. For our presentations today, we'll hear first from Donald Farmer with TDWI. And after Donald speaks, we'll be joined by William Smith with Databricks and Raj Gandali with Hexaware for presentations and a panel discussion. Before I turn over the time to our speakers, please allow me to go over a few basics. Today's webinar will be about an hour long, and at the end of their presentations, our speakers will host a question and answer period. So if at any time during these presentations you'd like to submit a question, just use the Ask a Question area on your screen to type in your question. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can click on the Technical FAQs area and you'll receive technical assistance. And if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, you can locate the resource window to download the PDF. Lastly, we are recording today's event and we'll be emailing you a link to an archived version so you can view the presentation again later if you'd like, or you can share with a colleague. Again, today we're going to be discussing redefining clinical operations with Agentic AI, and our first speaker is Donald Farmer. Donald is a research fellow with TDWI and is also an internationally respected speaker and writer with over 30 years of experience in data management and analytics. Donald advises investors, software vendors, and enterprises on data and analytics strategy, and he's led teams at Microsoft and Qlik building some of the most important and innovative analytics platforms on the market. With that, please welcome Donald, and I will hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here and great to be taking part in this webinar. One of the exciting things about the work that we do at TDWI is the range and depth of research and insight that we can bring to these conversations. And nowhere is this more apparent than when you're dealing with anything to do with healthcare or medicine or kind of clinical trials, because that's an area that have just become both operationally and analytically extremely complex in recent years, but for very good reasons, not just a negative thing, but there is more data available, there's more analytic power available, and it becomes a real test case for the latest technologies. Clinical trials today, as I suggest in the slide, are actually becoming unprecedentedly complex. The complexity of trial protocols has actually increased dramatically over the last decade, and it requires more and more data integration because there's more and more data sources involved in that. And that is a challenge. It's a challenge in terms of simply the data processing, but it's also a challenge in terms of the monitoring and governance of systems. Anyone who works in data knows that the more data sources and the more systems that are included, the more complex your governance becomes. But in areas which are highly governed and highly regulated, such as the clinical trials business, that really does become a real challenge. And this becomes as a result of the regulatory scrutiny. There's a lot of regulation, and the FDA inspections focus increasingly on data integrity. They are really concerned with this question of data. And of course, there's the market pressure demanding faster development cycles. So you have an advance in technology, which is generating more data. You have a greater focus on the integrity of data. You have a demand from the market for faster development, faster research, faster testing, faster trials. And you have also the decentralization, which is effective in being able to scale, but also increases the challenges of governance. So this is a complex, dynamic, rapidly moving space, which from my point of view as a data guy is a great space to be interested in. The topic of today's conversation, as we think about how artificial intelligence and how agentic intelligence in particular can help in these scenarios, that really becomes very relevant, because even if you as a viewer of the webcast are not specifically working in clinical trials yourself, there's a lot to learn from the technological advances and the methodologies that they're introducing. One of the most interesting things as you look at AI and you look at the agentic intelligent orchestration as it's developed is that it starts, in a sense, relatively simply with contextual reasoning. Agents like any AI system, learn from historical data patterns, and from those patterns, they can make decisions. And the systems that are built around those agents, they then adapt responsively to that. So the agent acts within a system. There can be many agents, multi-agent technologies working together. This enables us then to have collaborative problem solving. Agents can collaborate with each other, identifying, for example, data discrepancies, as I say here, and they can create their own resolution pathways, which is to say one agent can fix a data problem in one system, while another agent is fixing a data problem in another system independently. The system that overlooks this and manages the agents, that can look at some of these decisions and say it's too complex for an independent agent to handle. We may need to escalate. It could be an issue to do with data quality. It could be an issue to do with data privacy or ethics or governance. We can escalate that issue to a human being who can then oversee that process. Ultimately, what we're looking for then is the agents to become more and more collaborative and more capable of autonomous decision making. So what we end up with is agents coordinating seamlessly between the trial management systems and the laboratory platforms, and the overall system maintaining the audit trails, the governance and compliance is required to make sure all that works together. So what we have then is a flow from simple agents taking the traditional model of here's a historical pattern, let me make a decision based upon that, to a very modern system where agents are orchestrating amongst themselves, and the system is a system, if you like, of insight and oversight of the agent activities. When we do this, the AI agents really transform the oversight of clinical operations because they can perform intelligent risk assessment. The risk monitoring of what's happening in the system becomes adaptive, not just learning from historical patterns, but orchestrating together. So, for example, you can have intense monitoring of particular operations, and other operations which require less compliance or which require less close monitoring can be adaptively managed as well. So predictive models can actually identify where they need to, if you like, turn their attention, where they need to increase the intensity of monitoring. Another important aspect of this is a remote monitoring of systems. Very often, in modern practice, systems may be distributed across a country, across geographical boundaries, across organizational boundaries, and remote monitoring enables us to be much more intelligent about that. And then, of course, we have the eternal question of resource optimization. Where do we actually put our resources? It's one thing to have dynamically adaptive monitoring, but actually dynamically adaptive resource optimization can really help too. So that can include things like, for example, intelligent scheduling and automated reporting. Automated reporting reduces the manual documentation, which is a huge part of any clinical trials process. And intelligent scheduling, based on the risk of particular steps in the process, can really optimize the execution of the overall program. So resource optimization is, especially for global studies, is a really important part of the intelligent risk assessment, and if you like, the smartness of this agentic technology. So I've talked quite a few times then about how agentic technology can help, but what actually is it? What's behind this agentic technology? And I think while most people have some idea of that, it's useful to try and just be a little bit more precise about it. One thing about agentic technology is that it relies to a great extent, although you can have on-premises agents, especially for these globally distributed systems, cloud native platforms have a great advantage for agents. And one of the reasons for that is if I'm talking about dynamic optimization, dynamic allocation of resources, dynamic monitoring, cloud native platforms provide that scalability and that integration, enabling APIs to connect multiple systems, and the microservices architecture allows the kind of modularity that you need to deploy that. So cloud native platforms become quite an important part of a scalable agentic architecture. Advanced analytics, of course, are important because you want these agents to be able to do complex tasks. We may have natural language processing, and that is a great advantage in, for example, interpreting notes. If clinicians are taking notes, if there is documentation in the form of text, then all of that can become input to an agent, it become knowledge for an agentic system. If you have a natural language LLM style system in front of that. And we even have the ability to analyze images with computer with computer image interpretation. That becomes very important because increasingly clinical trials include a lot of imaging, a lot of scans, x-rays, and so on, which can now be digitized and interpreted with a lot of great accuracy, actually, by the computer vision systems. And then the final part of this is the real-time data streaming, which is something that is important for agents because agents are dynamic and interactive and perform in real time themselves. And so an event-driven architecture enables the agent to be responsive. Another part of that that's becoming interesting is the use of, for example, blockchain and distributed ledger technologies to ensure the integrity of the system from end to end. Not something we're going to discuss specifically today, but it's an emerging technology in this space that you should be aware of. Having said all of this, I've mentioned governance and compliance, of course, because it is an important issue, but we really do need solid approach, an enterprise-grade approach to the guardrails around the systems and the governance of the system. An important part of this is explainability. How do you explain the decision-making of these agents? People often say that the agent is a black box. We don't know what's going on inside it, but we do need an audit trail of the actions and recommendations that they're taking. And therefore, that enables us to have a human oversight of that capability. We need protocols for validation and qualification. How do we know that the decision that was made was the right decision or the best decision? How do we know that the risk was optimized? We need to be able to validate that in retrospect so that we can then train the systems to be better in the future. And then, of course, we must have, very importantly, with any sort of medical information or any sort of trial information, data privacy and security controls. That is absolutely required for regulations like GDPR and HIPAA, but also the encryption, the data access controls, the privacy protection that you can add to that enables us to bring in a wider range of analysts. If you can share this information in a way that is secure and private, then you can enable more people, more eyes on the problem, if you like, which is a very important part of successful clinical trials. So data privacy and security control isn't just a limitation on the system. It actually enables us to do more because we can bring more people and more systems into the process in order to sort of confidently run our clinical trials. What does a successful deployment look like? Well, one thing we need to do is I always suggest starting with a high impact but low risk use case. We need to build up our muscle memory for deploying agentic systems. As with any system, in fact, we need to learn these protocols ourselves. So you start with a high impact but low risk use case, which builds confidence in the system. You can scale gradually, but all the time you're adding expertise and you're increasing the governance of the system. So you'll start with, say, cross-functional teams that can combine IT, clinical teams. You want pilot programs, which are well-defined success metrics. All of that enables you to experiment and to test your governance of the system as it's developing. And ultimately, you need to invest in workforce development. People need to be trained, need to understand. They need to be both literate in these new systems and understand the basics of them. But increasingly, you'll also want staff who can develop these systems, can tune them, can take them further. And I think in the future, we're going to see absolutely people building careers around. Some people call it agentic wrangling. People who become the experts in managing agentic systems. So there's a definite progression here from starting with high impact, low risk systems through to building a workforce which is fluent and experienced with dealing with agentic systems. I always like to have a slide about what to do on Monday. I don't know if it'll be Monday, but it'll be whatever day that you want to get started on this after listening to our webinar. First of all, look at your existing data management. especially the pain points and manual processes that you have inside your existing clinical data systems. And I guarantee you're going to find a lot of them. There are always data management pain points in clinical systems. There are always manual processes in trial systems that could be that could be automated. So have a look at that and do a thorough assessment of your current situation, and form then a cross-functional team. And the cross-functional team is important because it's not just clinical operations. You're bringing in IT teams as well, and you probably bring in a regulatory team that will identify this first pilot use case, the low-risk, high-impact use case that will win a quick win with measurable impact. The measurable impact is also very important for building confidence in the system. And with that, I think you can make a really good, impactful start to an agentic approach to clinical trial management that will be very radical, very different from what you're doing today. With that, I'd like to ask Andrew to introduce the next speakers.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Donald. That was a fantastic presentation there. And yes, now it's my pleasure to introduce our first guest speaker today, William Smith with Databricks. Will is the Gen AI product lead and ML specialist in healthcare at Databricks. He initially worked in genomics and histology labs at National Institute of Health before working at Microsoft, where he focused on their cloud for healthcare. He has developed systems for companies such as CVS Health, Kaiser Permanente, United Healthcare, and more. With that, please welcome Will, and I will hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Hi, it's a pleasure to be here today and talk a little bit about how we at Databricks have worked with agents and our philosophies when developing in healthcare. So looking forward to chat about this today. We're going to talk about agentic systems in healthcare and life sciences. What are some of the guiding principles when designing agents? This is something that's kind of the underpinnings whenever we're trying to design a system, especially in healthcare and life sciences. So as many are familiar and what we discussed prior, compliance in terms of HIPAA, high trust, GXP, GDPR in some cases are incredibly important and non-negotiable, especially when designing agents that have autonomous behavior. We also need to look at monitoring and auditability, which oftentimes goes hand in hand with compliance. But how do we make sure that our agent is performing what we would like it to do, as well as have the mechanisms to double check on what it was doing, so that we can then, for auditing purposes, for administrations, or for government purposes, or for our own purposes for investigating anything that might go wrong, or to optimize further and certain autonomous workflows. Governance in terms of now that we're going into agentic architectures, agents in terms of LLMs typically have access to tools. So how do we make sure that those tools are governed? The model assets are governed in terms of the agent files, like agent.py. How do we make sure that the underlying data that they're accessing is also governed? So that's a big area of discussion. And then finally, to wrap it all up, we have safety and accuracy with robust evaluations. So how do we make sure that we evaluate our agents properly, make sure that we're not getting fooled by very good hallucinations or just kind of misinformation that might be retrieved from context and such. So these are just some guiding principles that we'll kind of hash out a little bit in the following slides. And so this is a big area of focus at Databricks in terms of access to LLMs, but also the evaluations components. So in terms of accessing LLMs, typically, for example, you might have OpenAI, you might have Bedrock, and the like. We have a number of LLMs that we actually serve through our foundation model API. So in this image, we have a playground where you can actually utilize Claude 3.7 Sonnet, Claude Sonnet 4, Llama 4 Maverick. So we have a mixture of open source models as well as partnerships with Anthropic and now Google for Gemini and Gemma. So that you can use them all within one platform. And in addition to, if you wanted to pull any weights from Hugging Face. So that's how we access our LLMs. We can secure these endpoints as well. How do we secure them in terms of more holistically? We have tools as well as the agents, including the LLM endpoints that I mentioned, that we're all going to link together. So some common questions that we may have are, what does the tool that we're giving the LLM have access to? Who has access to this tool in terms of modification? And then who has access to the underlying model as well? So with Unity Catalog, which is our central governance kind of system in Databricks, we can actually govern all of these assets as well as construct lineages to see what is consuming the different assets, who has permission, what the audit history behind them in terms of invocation. And you can see here the tools on the left-hand side, but also the actual endpoints on the right-hand side, where we have different versions as well as full activity logs and inference tables. So this is, again, like we look at more deeply now that we've secured our tools and agents. When we actually do an invocation on this agent, we can see the full trace history here, since we have an integration with MLflow as well as our own kind of additions on top of it, where we can actually decompose the entire chain, which is incredibly important for healthcare and life sciences, where we don't want a black box. We don't want any of these agents to be a black box where we don't know what's going on. We can see the inputs, the outputs, attributes in terms of metadata, every step of this LangGraph based agent, as well as all the sources for the retrieved context. So we want it to be as much of a glass box and facilitate that as much as possible. And these traces are built into the platform, all within MLflow, that are accessible and logged. So moving forward, some of the ways that we've reduced these tasks, because creating an agent from scratch takes a lot of time. So I think that we've gotten to a point where we've learned some of the key lessons in the industry, and are trying to make tools that kind of abstract a lot of the kind of monotonous work and then get the time to value as quick as possible. So a couple of the architectures that I particularly worked on, some automated kind of social needs intervention, as in terms of identifying different kind of potential social needs, or those indicators from clinical notes that are relatively unstructured, and then augmenting it with entity extraction, as well as an agent that can then consume those augmented clinical notes tables to recommend the action in terms of potential kind of intervention that needs to take place. And one key thing in healthcare and life sciences is having human in the loop, in addition to validation steps, because having a fully autonomous system sounds great in practice, but could potentially have a decent amount of widespread repercussions and damage. So in this case, it's pretty obvious that a practitioner would be that human in the loop component, but that's we make it so that these kind of diagrams, these kind of workflows have those validation steps as well as human in the loop for potential mitigation, because the margin of error for issues with this agent in healthcare and life sciences is the lowest among any industry. Furthermore, we also have patient throughputs that burn out like autonomous kind of workflows with like streaming capacity as well, based on like what the current kind of staffing at a given site is. So we can aggregate all of the different kind of data sources, because we are a central data platform with the Delta Lake, so that we can have everything onto cloud object storage in this data lake, and then work on top of it. So similarly, like we can use these kind of augmentation as well as these autonomous agents that can make decisions on this, to then give us information as to like what would be the right course of action that then administrators and stakeholders can then view and then act upon. So then we could see that there's certain augmentation steps in this workflow, as well as an agent that can take all this information in, potentially call more information that it needs, and then augment the final results for admins and the like to look at. So for the sake of time, I'm going to go real quick over what we're doing with Databricks, which is a way to simplify all this so that you can create an agent with all the niceties of the governance and the permissions monitoring and the like, all kind of done for you within Databricks and secured with service principals and OAuth, so that you can get going with getting this to value. So in certain cases, like use case, we have information extraction, multi-agent supervisors, knowledge assistants, and custom LLMs. Again, this is kind of like the easy button to get going with kind of these use cases and then applying them to your data and your situations, all while trying to adhere to those guidelines that we mentioned to make sure that things are safe, they're secured, and they're compliant. And I think this will be a good segue into the next presenter. So thank you for your time, and I'll pass it back to you, Andrew. Cheers.
Thanks so much. Well, that was fantastic. And yes, now it's my pleasure to introduce our next guest speaker, Raj Gandali with Hexaware. With over 2 decades of experience, Raj has been pivotal in building and scaling impactful teams in customer success, professional services, and product delivery. He spent 23 years at Sama as an executive, transforming it into becoming a SaaS platform leader in clinical data and analytics. He is now spearheading digital transformation in clinical solutions at Hexaware. With that, please welcome Raj, and I will hand it over to you now.
Thanks a lot, Andrew, and an awesome presentation, Will. What we're going to be talking about today is how we're using agents, right, as Hexaware in accelerating clinical development, the entire clinical development process, and where exactly in that process, right, agents are playing a role. So I'll take a step back and I'll walk you folks right through the entire life cycle, right, of clinical development, right from drug discovery to preclinical research, right, through clinical development all the way up to basically commercial launch and patient outcomes. It's an extremely time consuming and expensive process actually. And not every study or not every clinical study, right, meets its outcome. So at every stage, right, what we are trying to do, what we are working on is building different kinds of solutions, right? So we build solutions in preclinical research, some of those solutions built in clinical development, some in regulatory review, so on and so forth, right? And these solutions have evolved over a period of time. Some were built as data analytics AI solutions and now are basically being transformed, right, into agents, and how agents can actually help, right, in certain activities, say in clinical development, right? How can certain manual activities or certain time consuming activities, right, which are laborious, mundane in day-to-day activity, right, how can those be automated by agents and then handed off to humans, right, for review so that they can focus more of their time on much more strategic things. Okay. So the process or the approach that we have taken actually is take up a process or a clinical study life cycle, right? Right from protocol to submission, okay? At every stage, right? From when a protocol is designed to a study is set up, to the first patient, first visit, right? All the way to last patient, last visit, and the submission documents being prepared, right? We've identified personas within that life cycle who play a role. Okay, most of these personas, like a data manager or a clinical research associate or a safety monitor or a medical monitor, right, they play different kinds of roles, okay, throughout the life cycle. So we've mapped their day in the life, we've mapped basically their roles across the life cycle, and we're basically trying to understand, right, along with our customers, our sponsors, who are mostly pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, and CROs, right? What is the exact role, responsibility of these data managers? Okay, what are the activities that are extremely manual, time consuming, which are of high stress? I'll say high stress because these get piled up and they can potentially cause delays in a clinical study. So we are basically mapping out their day in the life, looking at basically their pain points, and then if an agent comes into play, right? Okay, what are the benefits that that agent can actually bring, okay, to a particular persona? Okay, eventually helping, okay, these data managers to do much more strategic work, and they can do more with less, or they can address more studies, they can focus on more studies, right, versus basically continuing to add data managers to a particular study, or as you scale, adding more and more data managers. Okay, now this is an example of how we go about, right, mapping a life cycle of a data manager, okay, or a persona within a clinical study before AI agents, right from 7:30 in the morning, right, when they actually start their day. Okay, there's a lot of manual work that they need to do, right? Reconcile data that has come that day in the morning, right, across multiple different systems. How much ever automated these systems are, there is a lot of manual work that goes on. There are a lot of spreadsheets that come in, and not every spreadsheet, right, makes it into an automated workflow. Okay, there's a lot of high stress queries, right, that they need to go and review first. Okay, find them, find out the root cause of those particular issues that have come up in the data, and then go and work with the sites, right, clinical sites, and figure out if it's indeed an issue that needs a data change request, or it's just basically a typing issue or some a data entry issue that has happened, right? All of these issues actually, if not resolved in time, okay, are going to lead in delays. Okay, then there's site training preparation, right, that they need to work with. As they add more sites, as studies get more and more complex, as studies go global, right, they need to train basically a lot of folks on how to use their systems, how to follow their SOPs, so on and so forth, right? and then DB log preparation. Okay, as you approach basically the end of a study, you need to basically make sure that all of the outstanding queries, right, that have basically been found out during the study are resolved. So there's a lot of activities, right, to and fro activities, manual, laborious, and too many loops, right, between different folks. Okay, and then obviously there is this weekend site support coverage that they need to do on an ongoing basis. This is life before agents. Believe me or not, they spend a lot of time on a lot of laborious tasks, and we need to really understand their day in the life so that when we design agents, right, okay, these agents are able to pick up the low hanging fruit, or are able to actually reduce the work that is getting piled up. After agents, right? When agents are introduced into their life cycle, okay. First of all, we want to basically make sure that with agents being introduced into their workflow, this has reduced the overall time, right? That actually they're working on laborious tasks. Okay. We want them to focus on more strategic things. So rather than going and finding out issues, right? We want basically the data managers to look at insights that have been provided by AI-powered monitoring dashboards. Okay, we want them to focus on basically strategic query resolution versus going and handling data inconsistencies, right, manually. Okay, we want to have them basically proactively have conversations with sites. Okay, since they are noticing trends much more earlier, since things are not piling up, we're actually helping data managers to shift left, okay, the process of finding issues within data. Okay, usually what happens is all of this gets shift right, okay, towards the end of basically the study, or as you're approaching database log, a lot of these queries get resolved and addressed, right? So we want to basically have agents work on that and shift left the process of finding issues, finding queries. So if you look at it, the before and after, right, after AI agents, okay, our goal, our initiatives basically with building these AI agents is to help improve quality of life of these data managers, okay, and then reduce the overall time, right, that they spend on manual laborious tasks, actually give them back 2 to 3 hours each day. Who wouldn't want that? Okay, and that's what AI agents actually should be doing. They should not be piling up or adding more work to you as another application. They should be actually doing some of the work, okay, that you are doing on a day-to-day basis. And this work basically can increase over a period of time. Initially, they might actually start with just small, low-hanging fruit activities, and then they can get into more complex reasoning activities too. Okay, our end goal actually, when we get into an organization and when we roll out agents, right, is for every persona. So if you look at it, like for a clinical research associate, for somebody like Amanda, who's a study feasibility specialist, or somebody like Dr. James Park, right, who's a biostatistician, we want to basically make sure before we roll out agents, we want to map their day in the life, okay, without AI or without basically agents, how much time are they spending? After agents, right, okay, how much actual time they would be spending. So we set up goals for ourselves, set up goals for basically these agents, so that you can measure it against a baseline. The baseline would be the current time that they spend, and then as agents get more intelligent, as agents get learn more about an ecosystem, learn about SOP, standard operating procedures that happen in a particular business function, like what happens with a CRA, what happens in a study feasibility process, right? What happens when you're actually analyzing data and creating submission data sets. Okay, the overall time spent, okay, is being tracked. Explainability is being called out, okay, and there is an audit of every activity that happens, and that's why we're able to basically compare the before and after really well. Okay, to enable this, right, if we were to build agents from scratch, it's a long, laborious process sometimes. Okay, and what we've taken an approach is we've actually built a lot of ready to use agents, okay, that are business focusing agents. Some of these agents basically can directly be added into a business workflow with some amount of configuration. We build these on stacks, right, that actually can be used for different kinds of purposes. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide. And finally, when you actually look at what an agent looks like in a system, okay, you will basically notice that, okay, this is a particular orchestrator agent like a data manager.ai agent. Okay, within that orchestrator agent, right, there are multiple worker agents like a data fetch agent, a DQ processing agent, a reconciling agent, right, a protocol check agent, and a task manager agent. The orchestrator agent determines, okay, how these other agents will be used, okay, or be put to work, right, within the workflow. When a new data set comes in, okay, the data manager.ai agent determines, right, should I actually call just the data fetch agent and the DQ processing agent, or should I have even the reconciling agent called in, okay, because there's data coming from multiple different sources, okay. In addition to that, basically there are things that the agent can get stuck with, okay. So when the agent is stuck in any given point of time, agent can actually go and check within a protocol, okay. Once it finds basically the issue, the agent can actually call a task manager agent, okay, to create a task and assign that particular task, right, to a individual within the system or to another agent, okay. Explainability, as we talked about, any and every activity that an agent works on, all of those activities are basically logged in. Any time an agent works on a particular discrepancy or an issue, every item is logged, ready for audit, and even there is explainability around that particular issue. Having said that, we'll move on to the discussion.
All right, terrific. Thank you so much, Raj. And yeah, now it's time for our panel discussion. So I'll ask for both Will and Donald to rejoin us. And Donald, I will pass it over to you to begin the discussion.
Thank you so much. That was what a great presentation. So much material there, and so much insight. Thank you very much, Will and Raj. My first question, it feels almost trivial compared to what you've been talking about. It says, where are you seeing agents being used today? I'm wondering, in particular, one of the things that I mentioned in my presentation was this need to find a high impact, low risk use case. And I'm wondering if you have, to make this question more precise, maybe you have examples of high value, low risk use cases that you're seeing agents being used in, to give people a sense of where they may get started.
Yeah, so there are a lot of use cases specifically in life sciences and pharma where there's a lot of thinking that happens. Okay, I'll give you an example. Like when you start a clinical study, okay, you need to identify sites, okay, for that particular clinical study. And it's a process. It includes basically reviewing the historical data, right, about that clinical study, okay, about different kinds of sites that have performed similar studies, and determining if the sites actually have all of the apparatus, right, that is needed, or all of the facilities that are needed, right, to basically address that study. And when finally will actually the site be able to recruit patients? Okay, so there's a lot of thinking, there's a lot of reasoning going on, and there's a lot of data lookups going on. Okay, wherever you see such kind of activities, a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of manual laborious tasks where it takes like 6 or 7 weeks to find sites. I think those are the use cases that are coming a lot to us. We're finding a lot what I talked about in Data Manager. We're finding a lot what we're finding in clinical research associates, what they have to do when they go to a site. Okay, there's a lot of checks that they need to do. And those are the use cases that we see around agents that keep coming to us.
So that's a fairly repetitive process. And once an agent has been trained or learned how to do that, it can be repeated against any site. And it's fairly a good candidate for automation. Yes. I suppose I need to ask you, is it a high stress task today, or is it a medium stress task today? I love that framing that you were using.
Yeah, so high stress is just because of volume and pile up, actually. I won't say high stress is because of complexity, but when there are a lot of low priority tasks, or I'll say is low complexity tasks, right, you tend to push them out. Okay, and that's what creates a lot of stress later on. And agents
Right.
don't really differentiate between these. Okay, so agents actually know that, hey, you know what? I'm working 24/7. I'm working like 365 days a year. Okay, and it's my job to actually do these 20 tasks. Okay, in an order that my orchestrator feels is correct, and that's basically the stress part and how agents can actually help reduce the stress too.
Excellent. Yeah, I understand. Will, do you have examples of these kind of high value but low risk tasks that you're seeing commonly being converted, if you like, or adopted by agentic systems?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think that there's you highlighted it very key in terms of like trying to ease into it, because a lot of institutions are risk adverse, as they likely should be, in terms of high value, low risk, right? Like Raj was mentioning, there's a lot of monotonous tasks that actually take like human reviewers or just like analysts to perform every single day. In some cases, and like source to target mapping for claims analysis, it can take like 80 hours for someone to review a spreadsheet. We're talking about very high dimensional data in terms of a spreadsheet, like in terms of column and row, like thousands of rows and over 500 columns at a time that someone is just manually reviewing and
Wow.
seeing for like mistakes. And some of the mappings end up being like very easy, where the rules are actually A to B, not necessarily compound logic that requires someone. So a lot of the monotonous work that ends up taking a lot of human labor hours can be automated away with the relatively low risk, because the logic is pretty straightforward. And then highlighting based on confidence intervals by by trying to do like decomposing softmax and stuff like that from the actual LLM to figure out, like, highlight ones that need human intervention to keep human in the loop. So if you think about maybe if we cut about 80% of the work away from monotonous tasks like that, that's a tremendous amount of savings both for labor as well as downstream costs. So like specific ones are a lot of times, like at least in healthcare, a lot of use cases end up being, coming from a lot of the text it's captured, like clinical notes in terms of instrumentation notes and stuff like that, that ends up sitting, and then someone has to review that and then derive insights and pass it downstream. In some cases, that text can just be kind of messy because people are trying to write it as they're trying to talk to someone and stuff like that, or automatically collected. So those insights can be a little bit deeper, that actually requires someone to look at it. So like what I was talking about, social needs intervention, that can indicate like social need indicators, social determinants of health can be extracted. So there's so much information that we can get from these data sources, but we just don't have the time, because honestly, like people, the amount of opportunity costs as well as the items that we have for clinical staff is endless, right? There's always a backlog of stuff. So we find agents used in all of that in terms of deriving insights from those data sets. And then having them autonomously do like recommendations for physicians, for administrators, for scheduling, for physicians for next best action, for claims management, for like form regulatory. We see a lot of disruption in that space. So yeah, a lot of like what Raj was mentioning, monotonous tasks that are actually pretty straightforward, but they can be automated, so that's low risk, and then we can build on top of that to make more complex agents with human in the loop mechanisms for maybe potentially higher risk activities, like in terms of research for diagnosis and stuff like that off of scans and images.
Right. Thank you.
Pardon me, Raj. Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's fascinating because when I was researching this myself in preparation for the webinar, the one thing that I really noticed, and I mentioned on my very first slide, was just the sheer complexity nowadays of the protocols that people are involved in. And then not necessarily each individual work item is not necessarily difficult. It's just the sheer scale of it. And that seems to be a great opportunity for agents to help. So a very important aspect of this that I also want to introduce the next question, maybe I'll start with you, Will, about this, is when we talk about our agentic projects, what kind of timescales are we talking about? How long does it take to get value out of one of these agentic systems?
Sure, yeah. And So historically, right, like people needed to understand, for example, pulling model weights and stuff from Hugging Face, loading those on GPU-based clusters, and then figuring out batch inference and stuff like that for some of these cases, just like components, right? For an autonomous workflow, people had to learn like LangGraph and LangChain, make sure they constructed the tools. And so all of this is just like a precursor to say that the typical time to value in the past, which we're moving away from, could be pretty lengthy, and you oftentimes need specialized personnel to do it. I think Ross touched on this a little bit, and we're working on this quite a bit to ease that so that we can, all of those kind of setup and burden that you might have to develop the agentic system, like the governance structure, networking, authentication to different aspects with the tools. How do you create tools? How do you log those? Trying to abstract those away as much as possible, because you don't necessarily need the folks like that developing if you're already on a platform, or if you're working with a team that has the expertise and could potentially do knowledge transfer. So to answer your question with the typical time to value, I think we're quickly going to a shorter kind of runway with that. I think right now it could be anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the if you're working vigorously on it, depending on the complexity of it. So for example, I just built out a agentic system, mostly a knowledge basing for automatic kind of retrievals for call centers. And that took, I think, with advanced optimizations, really about 60 days. So about 2 months. But that's like on the top end of like actually having DSPy optimizations and like advanced techniques, whereas a simple proof of concept could easily take, like just 2 weeks or so to start actually showing the initial values propositions and those kind of aggregations. And then the production rollout will just come after that.
Okay, so it's not a matter of hours. It definitely is days and weeks to do it, but very much more rapid than onboarding a human being to do the same job.
Absolutely. And in terms of, that's a great point, because I typically get down into the weeds. If we were to say, like, say a citizen, AI engineer or something like that, I think the tooling now, like we have with Agentbricks, if you set up like your table, have an agent in actual minutes. So
right.
To your point, like the tooling now, it reminds me of when I had to write like an agent from scratch, which was about 700 lines in LangGraph. And now you could just go into a playground, export the code, and then boom, you have an agent you can immediately deploy. So I'll correct myself a little bit in that, in terms of the actual prototyping now is actually on the scales of minutes and hours. And then when I was talking about in terms of the productionization for an enterprise, that could take longer for a variety of reasons. Yep.
Sure, and to be fair, this is a highly governed space, so going from a very rapidly deployed agent to an agent that's actually capable of taking on all the governance and compliance requirements would naturally be a bit longer. Raj, could I ask you about this with a particular kind of target towards kind of the Hexaware point of view? In your experience, how long does it take to kind of onboard and get time to value with your technology?
Yeah, so the build time actually is much smaller. Okay, so to build out an agent, as we talked about, right? You could do that sometimes in a day, depending on the complexity. Sometimes it might take you a couple of weeks. Okay, the rollout sometimes could be a challenge because this is a regulated industry, and agents that you build, right, need to be deployed into a customer's environment. Okay. So when you're going through that particular process, I'd say 6 to 8 weeks is a good timeline, right? Okay, to roll these out, okay, so that they can start acting on certain activities immediately. Okay. Now, agents are continuous learning systems. Okay, they will learn a lot about process. Okay, as long as it's governed really well. Okay, so over a period of time, I would say you need to observe their behavior. And once they are in an environment, once they're learning a lot and they're ready to take on more activities, right? Time to value would really come in. I'd say you'll start seeing a lot of value from the 3rd month onwards, okay? And a lot more value, right? Every month, because as trust increases, the number of activities that an agent does, right, increases too. Okay, and your ultimate goal is to see, right, how an agent can actually replicate all of the activities that a human user is actually working on, okay, that are time consuming.
That's great. Thank you very much. It's super interesting. So I think I'm sure we have some questions from the audience, Andrew. Perhaps it would be good to ask some of these and get get some key questions answered.
Yeah, terrific. And thank you all for that great discussion. We do have some questions here from the audience, so I'll just jump in. And Will, we'll start with you for this question. This came in during the last round there where you were answering that last question. This person asks, how are organizations handling the governance, safety, and accuracy component with agentic systems, given the low margin of acceptable error in healthcare?
Yep, absolutely. It's a fantastic question because I think that it's an evolution over that period of time where we saw originally with evaluations and governance where we didn't have too much of the potential repercussions. If someone had access to an LLM that didn't have any access to underlying data sets and stuff like that, really it was more of, how are you going to blow up your APIs and costs like that. Right now we moved into where if you create a tool that might have like clinical information, potential PHI underlying, right? Well, if you have an agent that has unrestricted access to that table, as well as no row or column level security, if someone gets access to that, you could essentially, that agent could exfiltrate all of the PHI. Now you have a massive headache on your hands, right? So for right now, I'm seeing that there's a lot of people, admittedly, from my experience, has been people had thought that they doing normal permission access to an LM, as well as like evaluations with basic LLM as a judge was enough. And I think that folks are now seeing that LM judges without any kind of guidelines and stuff like that actually ended up showing hallucinations that were convincing enough that people kind of had the idea that things were properly secured, as well as operating the way that they were supposed to. And this might be an extension of the question. But in terms of the accuracy and safety, I think that we might have fallen into a sense of false security because of these tools without actually tuning them. Where just in the beginning, when we saw LLMs with hallucinations, we see those kind of creep into the evaluations as well, because using an LLM as a judge is very useful for kind of NLP tasks where you can't use other metrics, but it also offers. So like a good example of this was if you had a unit of measurement for treatment for an adult versus an infant, depending on the light of the context, we saw one agent that didn't find that point change in it, and then would ended up kind of either potentially giving treatment information from an adult for an infant. And obviously that has a lot of issues, but that could be one word in evaluation that just has a green check mark, and then someone just says, okay, this looks good to me. So in terms of how they're handling government safety and accuracy, right now, I think that we are learning from our mistakes, and there's definitely a better place that we need to be. But organizations like Databricks and Hexaware have a lot of focus on this and expertise, such that like we can set up MLflow with these fine-grained evaluations with criteria derived from your data sets very, very easily, and creating those evaluation data sets programmatically. And then the governance structure, like with Unity Catalog, Databricks, for example, we can then do granular permissions, not only on the agent itself, but the tools that it has, and then on the underlying data sets as well, just as extra layers of security on that governance kind of layer, so that you don't end up in those situations where an agent can inadvertently exfiltrate information that is privileged because the tool wasn't secured properly.
Awesome. That was terrific. Yeah, Donald, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to maybe dig into one little aspect of this a little bit more, which is I think the idea of setting up this sort of governance program and using, say, Unity Catalog at the heart of that seems pretty interesting. How repeatable is it? Is this something that has to be done for every new trial? Or is it something which can be set up and repeated for trials in the future? I'm just wondering how much of this work is a question of establishing and then letting it run, so the entire organization runs that way, or is it something which has to be determined for every trial independently?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point, because we want it to be as repeatable as possible, because it ends up being a lot of overhead, which we're actually trying to remove by using agents in the first place, right? So there's a number of ways that we do it. The main way, in terms of like all kind of converging to one ideology, is with Unity Catalog. It truly is like a Unity portion of unified governance across everything, and that can even like sync with SCIM providers like Entra ID and others, so that we can end up having it so that we can repeat the structure of these kind of experiments. We have all of these assets in terms of the model endpoints, the tables, the model artifacts. All of those are considered assets in Unity Catalog that have their own governance structures. So and then we have a 3-tiered namespace of like tables, schemas, and catalogs. The reason I mention all of that is that because we have it such that we have that 3-tiered namespace, we can have like different business units or projects either allocated to different catalogs and schemas, and then we could create groups. Like maybe there's a specific research group A, research group B, and then they have their own respective projects. Then instead of going to each of those assets and updating them according to these folks with these permissions, we can then automate that either through code or just like, creating the groups through UI, and then make sure that there's consistency in the platform, that group A has permission to this catalog or schema, to B to this one. And then depending on how you want to do the assets underneath that, you can then apply that. We can then utilize this template towards new projects, like programmatically, through kind of Databricks asset bundles and other things, kind of like Terraform, so that you can then get this template, and then as you roll people in, utilize this template to create all these resources with the respective permissions, and then you can get rolling without having to hand tune it every single time.
Great, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that was terrific. And we'll move on to the next question here. Raj, we'll go to you for this one. This person asks, how is user experience being addressed with agents?
Yeah, so this is a great question, actually. Now, agents work with existing tools most of the times. Okay, so their tools could be applications, and agents are working with existing tools. So practically speaking, there is no user experience per se. But that's not always the case, actually. You need to understand all of the different kinds of tasks that an agent has worked on. Okay. You need to understand all the different kinds of reasoning things that the agent has thought about, right? And you need to really understand all the different kinds of activities that that agent has worked on, okay, when it's actually working with actual tools. Okay. So what's really happening is there are existing tools. Okay, when I say tools, like existing applications like a CTMS system, EDC system, I'm not anticipating a lot of UX changes in those systems. Okay, but for individual agents, basically there'll be a lot of logging, okay, and a lot of tracking and a lot of audit kind of checks, right? And even explainability UX, okay, that needs to be engineered. Okay, so at any given point of time, if you're looking at a data manager agent, okay, what the data manager agent did in a clinical data landscape, you don't need a separate UX for that. Okay, but basically within that particular SaaS application, but to actually figure out, right, later on, okay, on a monthly basis or on a weekly basis, right, different kinds of studies that that agent worked on, or different kinds of discrepancies that that agent really came across, and what was the reasoning, what was the thinking that that agent actually went through, right? There could be a separate UX or a separate UI that logs all of it, that can be used by administrators or by the users who have deployed these agents, right, to track their activity. So agent tracking, agent audit, agent explainability will have a separate UX. How much, if an agent is working with an existing tool, okay, or a SaaS application, there won't most probably be a separate UI because the agent logs in as an actual user. In some cases, if you're building a completely brand new application just with agents, then you need to mimic user experience as close as it will be as possible, right, to what a human user is going to work on or work with.
I'm very intrigued by the thought that
Go ahead, Donald.
Sorry, I was just going to say I'm very intrigued by the thought that, in a sense, user experience goes away with agents. That the user experience, because the agent is kind of adopting everything under the hood, that the experience goes away. I think that's kind of fascinating, and I wonder. In general, I just wonder how that will drive design decisions in the future. It's going to be fascinating. It's going to be a fascinating future.
Absolutely. We're already in it.
Yes, true.
Awesome. Well, unfortunately, this leaves us with no time remaining today. So I do want to thank our speakers. We did hear from Donald Farmer with TDWI, William Smith with Databricks, and Raj Gandali with Hexaware. Would also like to thank those companies, Databricks and Hexaware, for sponsoring today's webinar. And please remember, we did record today's webinar. We'll be emailing you a link to an archived version of the presentation. And if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, you can locate the resource window to download the PDF. And finally, for those unfamiliar, TDWI hosts in-person educational events. Our next one is in San Diego, taking place August 18th through the 22nd. As a valued webinar attendee, we're offering each and every one of you $100 off any event package. Please check your post-webinar communications for a unique discount code and a link to further details. And from all of us here, let me say thank you so much for attending. This does conclude today's event.